Hey, now it's the Rob from 1061 KISS FM here with my 16-bit colleague.
Hey guys, it's Steve, web contributor to 1061evansville.com, and I've seen this man's Hadouken, and it's impressive.
Thank you, Steve. We are under the bright spotlights today, so bear with us, but we've got a great conversation for you, and I need to point out, if we ever need to change the name of this podcast, we are certainly the best dressed podcast out there. That is another spiffy shirt. I do like that Ninja Turtles shirt you've got there, Steve.
Thank you very much.
Okay, let's talk about, so last week we talked about the 1980s and the impact that it had on video games. And now I want to talk about the 1990s because, first of all, that is the next decade chronologically. Second of all, I would consider those my peak years of gaming, if it's not now. And at least when I became those were my adolescent years.
Yeah.
And my favorite decade of gaming was certainly the 1990s. So, Steve, what's your thoughts on 90s gaming?
Doing research for this episode, I've realized that the 1990s was just an abundance of video games. That 10-year stretch, so much happened.
And a lot that has an impact on the current gaming scene.
Yes.
Which every game on my list, and I've got a bunch on my list I want to talk about, has impacts on games that release this year.
Yeah.
Like, for example, while you could talk about the Super Nintendo and Super Mario World, the game of the Mario franchise that I want to talk about this week is Super Mario 64.
Okay.
Because while it's not one of my favorite Mario games, I do prefer the 2D platforming as opposed to the 3D platforming. This represented the shift that the 1990s took.
Yeah.
With the Nintendo 64, they tried to make all of these incredible 2D gaming experiences into a 3D polygonal world that sometimes would work out better than others.
Yes.
Mario, as an example, that game succeeded. While it's not one of my favorites, it took the series to new levels, and there are still 3D Mario games getting released annually. You know, there are so many games where Mario is in a 3D environment, not just walking left and right, trying to ultimately to get to stage right as far as possible, right?
Yes, exactly. In that game, I just remember taking a few minutes just to run around in circles, just because you can.
I can't really remember a game where I could control the camera and my player at the same time like that. Having a stick designed for the camera, the C-stick, my understanding is actually stood for camera in the beginning.
Yeah.
So it was that was a very unique experience that was testing the waters of 3D gameplay.
Yes.
Let's talk, and likewise, Doom.
Yeah, that's on my list.
Was also doing the very same thing. Doom, Wolfenstein, they were putting you in different environments that as video gamers we weren't used to seeing. We weren't used to being able to... That was the first-person shooter as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
And how huge is that on today's gaming
Oh
scene?
my goodness, yes.
Everything is a first-person shooter.
Yeah, and Doom was the original. I mean, to get in there and
Sure.
see that from your perspective. Yeah.
What are some other games on your list?
Some of mine, talking about the abundance, the 80s really kind of blew up the one-on-one fighter games, Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat.
Both on my list.
What I also noticed is the movie games exploded.
You talking about like licensed games?
Yeah, Star Wars, anything Stallone made apparently had a video game. My personal favorite was Disney's Aladdin.
Aladdin was such a good Sega Genesis game. Disney
Yes.
did make some solid games. Other great licensed game includes stuff from The Simpsons.
Yes.
There was a lot of good stuff. Almost
Ninja
always.
Turtles.
And don't forget, anything made by LJN
Yes.
was usually a licensed game, and oftentimes a pile of dump. Let's move forward here. So you mentioned Street Fighter, you mentioned Mortal Kombat. I think that it's fair to mention Sonic the Hedgehog.
Yes.
If for no other reason, while he may not have blazed a whole lot of new trails, he represented that console war period that I adore so much between Sega Genesis and the Nintendo, Super Nintendo. What about games like Resident Evil and Tomb Raider?
Yes.
I think that they are... Those were the first games. I'm not even talking about like survival horror, although you certainly could point. A lot of people point the finger to Resident Evil to being the first survival horror game.
Yes.
But just that 3D atmosphere, the tank controls with the steady camera that doesn't move,
Yes.
that is still very relevant in today's gaming atmosphere.
Yeah.
Crash Bandicoot, I feel like was the face of Sony, rightfully or wrongfully, for quite a long time. Agreed?
Yes, agreed.
I feel like it was in the 1990s where gaming got this stereotype of being violent.
Yeah.
And that is sort of towards the late '90s. I'm going to just lump that in with the Grand Theft Auto series. With the first two did release in the 1990s. But yeah, by the beginning of the decade, I feel like video games were kind of fun and dorky, the way people perceived them,
Yes.
and then the perception became kind of violent and just not a safe thing for your kids necessarily.
Yeah.
Not a family thing.
Yeah, hence the rating system that came out
In the 1990s,
Yeah.
exactly. Do you have any more on your list?
Being a wrestling fan, I have to mention Monday Night Raw on the Super Nintendo.
WWF Raw.
Yes.
Yes, I do remember that game.
That game, all the way up to 1999, WrestleMania 2000, one of my favorite wrestling games of all
A
time.
lot of great wrestling games, and while we're talking about sports or fake sports, NBA Jam
That's on my list.
and NFL Blitz, the
Yes.
arcade approach to sports games, where it didn't necessarily need to look real. It just needed to be fun.
Yes.
And that was what the 90s were about. The 80s and 90s, more so than any other decades to me, people were trying to have fun.
Yes.
And makers like Acclaim knew that with NBA Jam and NFL Blitz. You have more?
I've got just a couple character names. Again, with the whole abundance theme, it's like we have Mario, we've got Sonic. Let's come up with other names. You mentioned Crash Bandicoot. They had Croc. They had Kirby. They had Banjo and Kazooie.
Right.
All names they just tried to make brands out of. None as successful as Mario.
Right, Kirby's still around today.
Yes.
Banjo-Kazooie on life support, maybe, but those were great games. I want to talk about the Zelda franchise, which is still alive and well today. To me, took a real high turn in the 1990s. The two best games from that franchise, I think people would probably agree, are A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time, both of which came out in the 90s. There was a nice little surge for handheld gaming.
Yes.
While Tetris I associate more with the 80s, games like Pokemon came out in the 1990s and took over. I mean, they're among the highest selling franchises in all of video games, those little Pokemon games. And to be honest with you, just this January, I put 65 hours into a new Pokemon game on my 3DS. Wow. So I think that represents the handheld atmosphere, the handheld generation of video games, which really wasn't a thing, unless you're talking about those little Tiger handheld mini games. They weren't a thing until the Game Boy came around in 1989. Role-playing games, Final Fantasy, they took a big step up, and other RPGs like Chrono Trigger. How many Final Fantasies came out in the 90s? A whole bunch of them. They're on 15 now. They're still making those games. What about games like Mario Kart? When they come out, they still shatter sales records. Started in the early 90s on Super Nintendo. There's been one on like every Nintendo console since. That's massive.
Yeah, Mario Kart was one that showed that Mario's going to be bigger than just a side-scrolling.
He does more than save princesses. He drives cars fast, and he litters banana peels.
Yes.
I wrote down a game called Night Trap, or Sega CD games. What they did was they took actual human footage, camera footage, and put those into video games. QuickTime events, for what they're called now. They're a staple in video games, whether they're actual human beings or they're actors portraying them or they're just CGI. They're a part of gaming that started in the 1990s. The only version of a cutscene in the 1980s was Pac-Man, getting chased by the ghost for a second between levels. You know what I mean?
Yeah, or him meeting Miss Pac-Man.
Right, exactly. Or getting, he leave the screen, he'd get bigger, and then try to eat up the ghosts.
Yeah.
That was a QuickTime event. That was a cutscene. Those became so different in the 1990s. They became part of the game, which I think is huge. And I wrote down, I wanted to mention accessories and peripherals like the Super Scope 6 or Time Crisis, where you're actually shooting at a screen. That became very ahead of its time. It wasn't until 10 years later that the Wii was even announced to be a thing, and then motion controls changed everything. And from there, you have the Wii Sports, you have the Wii Remote and everything it can do. You have the guitar and drum peripherals. Every sort of peripheral, I feel like, can be dated back to like the Zapper from the 80s. But it kind of, if the 80s was the Zapper, the 90s was the Super Scope.
Yeah.
So I like the 90s, and I like how you can trace everything great about video games today, I feel like, back to the 1990s. Agreed?
Agreed. Even the birth of the disc. They got away from cartridges.
That's a great point. The cartridges are now totally out of date. They look like collector's items or artifacts now. Discs, you have loading time, you have all sorts of stuff. And now, And we're getting to the point where discs are becoming out of date.
Yes.
Now it's all download content. So it shows the evolution, and I feel like gaming took a real shape in the 1990s.
Yeah, definitely.
So I still think, while we do like to focus mostly on modern games, we should continue our conversation next week, focusing on the first decade of the 2000s, Steve.
Agreed.
Because those are still, while maybe not our favorite decade, deserves its recognition.
Yes.
So we'll talk about the first decade of the 2000s, games and systems from 2000 to 2010 in the next episode of the 16-Bit Superstars. So for myself, the Man in Black,
And Steve.
we're gonna say goodbye until next week. Thank you for watching the 16-Bit Superstars.
Thanks, guys.